Welcome to the deep dive. We're going to try to untangle this whole situation with the US, Russia, and Ukraine. Could there be a ceasefire? Maybe even like a bigger peace plan down the line? It's complicated, so let's get right to it.
It really is complicated. One thing that's super interesting is how the U.S. has changed how it's handling these peace talks.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. What's different now?
Well, it used to seem like, the U.S. was kind of pushing Ukraine to take a deal that basically was what Russia wanted. Like, they wanted Ukraine to just settle on Russia's terms. But now they're saying, hold on, we need a ceasefire first. Like, that's the first step to, a real peace plan, not just a quick fix. It's a pretty big change.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big shift. So what does Russia think about this whole ceasefire idea?
They're basically saying, look, a ceasefire doesn't mean anything if there's no, solid plan for the talks. They don't want to just stop fighting for a bit if it's not going to actually lead to something.
Okay, so then what does Russia want? What are they trying to get out of this?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. They want the world to legally recognize that the territory they've taken during this conflict is theirs, which, as you can imagine, is causing some problems.
I can imagine. Okay, so that's Russia. What about Ukraine? They said they'd be open to a 30-day ceasefire, but they also had a condition, right?
Yeah, they said Russia has to agree to it, too. And this is coming right after those talks between the U.S. and Ukraine. And the U.S. said they'd start sending military aid again. The timing's interesting.
It really is, especially because, it's just a few days ago that Ukraine was saying, no day, we're not giving up any land. It seems like a really fast change of heart.
Right. And on top of that, just before these talks even happened, Ukraine launched a pretty big drone strike near Moscow.
And people were killed. So not exactly the best way to start peace talks,
Definitely not. Makes you wonder, what Ukraine is really trying to do here. Are they serious about peace?
Yeah, are they just trying to look like the good guys while still showing off what they could do militarily?
Could be. There's definitely a lot of political stuff going on behind the scenes here.
For sure. And while we're talking about all the different people involved, what about the European leaders? They've got their own ideas about how to make peace, right?
Yeah, most of them have this plan where they want to give Ukraine even more weapons and defenses. Basically, they want to make Ukraine's military a lot stronger.
So why are they doing that?
They say it's to give Ukraine more power when they're at the negotiating table with Russia. The stronger they are, the better deal they can get.
But doesn't that mean they're not expecting Ukraine to give up any territory? That goes against what Russia wants, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And to make things even more complicated, they also want some kind of guarantee that Ukraine will be safe, which basically means having international troops actually there. That makes me wonder if Russia would ever agree to a ceasefire with all that going on. It's almost like they're, getting ready for more fighting instead of less.
This is getting really messy. Ukraine's offering a ceasefire, but they also launched that drone attack, and now the European leaders want to send them more weapons instead of just focusing on talking things out. It's like everyone has a different plan.
It really is. And the fact that Ukraine offered that ceasefire right after that drone attack?
You think they're trying to make it look like Russia's the one who doesn't want peace, even if the talks fail?
Maybe. And that would put President Trump in a really tough spot.
He's been trying to get Putin to the table to end this, hasn't he?
He has. So this could totally mess that up and give more power to the people who want to keep fighting.
This is getting really out of hand. This isn't just a little border dispute anymore. It's like people are calling it a proxy war, which sounds scary. And they're saying it could be really bad for Europe in the long run.
Yeah, that's the big worry. All this focus on getting more weapons and building up armies. It's like, what if that actually makes things more dangerous instead of safer?
Yeah, it's a really scary thought.
It's like all this talk about sending more and more weapons to Ukraine as if that's the way to get peace, I don't get it.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that Europe might be the one stuck dealing with this conflict if it goes on too long, this whole proxy war idea. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. When we say proxy war, what we mean is that it's not just about Russia and Ukraine anymore, right? It's like the U.S. and Europe are involved too, each with their own goals, and it's become this big stage for them to fight it out, kind of.
So this is about way more than just some land in Ukraine. It's about who has the most power in the world.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's what makes it so dangerous. If this keeps going on, it could be really bad for Europe. Their economy could tank, their politics could get messed up, and it could be a huge security risk.
So you're saying Europe might end up having to handle this whole mess, maybe even become more dependent on the U.S. for help? But you also said there was something else going on, something even deeper than just a disagreement between the U.S. and Europe.
Right. There's this theory, and it's kind of disturbing, that there are actually people within the U.S. government who are like trying to stop any peace deals from happening.
Whoa, really? Sabotaging peace.
Well,
But why would they want this conflict to keep going?
power, basically, and control. Think about it. If there's always this threat from Russia, it's easier to do things that people wouldn't normally like.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, they can say, we need to send a ton of money on the military because Russia's a threat. Or they can say, we need to be stricter, more controlling because of the Russian threat. It's like when people are scared, it's easier to, take away their freedoms. It's happened a lot throughout history.
That's kind of terrifying. So you're saying there are people in the U.S. who would benefit from this war in Europe, even if it means everyone else suffers?
It's a possibility, and a pretty scary one. We have to ask ourselves, who is actually winning from all this? And who is paying the price?
Okay, let's say you're right, and there are these people who want to keep the war going. How could they even do that? I mean, how do you influence something that big?
There are a lot of ways you can use politics, money, even culture. We're talking about like decades of building connections with governments, especially with their military and intelligence people.
So it's like they're using those connections to pull strings behind the scenes.
Yeah.
To get people to make decisions that benefit them.
Yep. But it's not just about governments talking to each other. There are these really powerful people in America, the elites, and they can control what the media says, what the think tanks say, and that shapes how people see the conflict.
And how are they portraying it?
They're saying Russia is just pure evil, the ultimate aggressor, and that anyone who tries to talk to them is weak. It's like this super simple view, good versus bad, and it doesn't allow for any, understanding of the situation.
And we've seen that a lot in the news, haven't we?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's this whole campaign to keep sending weapons to Ukraine and to make anyone who talks about peace look like a traitor.
Wow. So it's like they're controlling the story and they're controlling what the governments do. And meanwhile, Europe is stuck in the middle of all this, trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that everyone has their own agendas, right? The US, Russia, Europe, even different groups within those places. It's really complicated.
It's like this huge game of chess, and Europe's future is on the line. We talked about this transatlantic split, but maybe it's more than that. You said it might be planned.
That's the big question, right? On the surface, it looks like the US and Europe are fighting each other. But some people think they're actually working together, that they've split up the work.
Split up the work. What do you mean?
Well, imagine if Europe was the one mainly dealing with the Russia problem, right? But to do that, they'd need the US to keep giving them money and weapons. And that would free up the US to focus on other things.
Like China, maybe?
Exactly. They could be like, we're the ones protecting democracy from China. And all the while, Europe is dealing with this huge mess right next door.
That doesn't sound good for Europe at all. I mean, they'd be spending all their money on this war, their economy would suffer, and they'd be even more dependent on the U.S.
That's the risk. They become the front line in someone else's fight.
And what about Ukraine? Where do they fit into all this?
Honestly, it's really sad. They're stuck in the middle like a pawn in this big game. It doesn't seem like they have much control over what happens to them.
So if this division of labor actually happens, what does it mean for Europe in the long run?
It could mean that they're always in danger, always having to spend money on their military, always relying on the U.S. It's not a very hopeful picture.
And what about this idea that Russia's a huge threat? Will that just keep going even if they make peace?
That's a really good question. Maybe they'll just say, okay, we have peace now, but we still need to be ready for Russia to attack again. Like they'll always be scared of Russia?
So even if there's peace, Europe will still feel like it has to have a big army, always watching out for Russia.
Yeah, pretty much. And that pressure would come from inside Europe and from outside, like from the U.S.
It's like it's inevitable that they'll fight again. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And who's really losing in all this?
The people in Europe. They're the ones who will suffer the most, Their lives will be harder, their economy will be worse. They're the ones who pay the price.
It's a lot to think about. Okay, last part of our deep dive here. We've talked about a ceasefire, this whole proxy war thing, and even this idea that the U.S. and Europe are splitting up the work. And it sounds like some people might actually want this conflict to keep going. It's wild.
It is. It's really important to wrap our heads around how complex this is and think about what could happen, even the bad stuff.
Right. So what could happen next? What does the future look like for Europe, for Ukraine, for everyone?
Well, one thing that could happen, maybe the simplest thing, is that the fighting just keeps going. This conflict drags on, and there's no end in sight.
So like a forever war, where no one really wins.
Exactly. Everyone just keeps fighting and fighting, wasting resources, making things worse and worse, and nothing gets solved.
That would be awful for Ukraine. But what about the rest of the world? Would it hurt Europe and the economy globally too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. A war in Europe would mess up trade, prices would go up, and we could even have a global recession. No one wants that.
I hope it doesn't come to that. What else could happen?
Another possibility is that they finally agree on a ceasefire. Maybe because everyone's putting pressure on them, or maybe they're just too tired to keep fighting.
But we talked about how shaky a ceasefire could be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Russia wants to keep the land they took. Ukraine says no way. And Europe's like, here's more weapons, Ukraine. It doesn't sound very peaceful.
You're right. That's a big problem. It could be super tense, and the fighting could start again really easily.
And even if they do stop fighting, how do they fix the stuff that started the war in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, right? A ceasefire just means they stop shooting for a while. It doesn't solve anything. If they don't deal with the real problems, it's like they'll just be waiting for the next fight to start.
So a ceasefire might help for a little bit, but it's not a real solution. Is there anything better that could happen?
Well, the best thing would be if they could actually sit down and make a peace agreement that works for everyone, something that would make things peaceful and stable in the long run.
But is that even possible? Everyone seems so stuck in their positions,
Yeah, it would take a lot. Everyone would have to be willing to compromise, to give up some of what they want for the greater good. They'd have to really commit to talking things out, even when it's hard.
And right now, it doesn't seem like anyone's ready to do that.
True. But things can change fast in this world. There have been a few little signs of hope, at least.
Like when Ukraine offered that ceasefire.
Yeah, and the fact that President Trump is still talking to Putin, even though it's probably super tense, those are small steps, but at least it shows they haven't completely given up on talking.
So maybe, just maybe, they could work things out peacefully.
We gotta hope so, right? Even though there are a lot of challenges and things could go wrong really easily, the alternative is just too awful to think about. A future where they just keep fighting forever.
This whole deep dive has been intense. I mean, it makes you realize how complicated everything is and how easy it is for things to go really bad.
It does. It reminds us how important peace is, and how much work it takes to keep it.
We've covered a lot today. We talked about a ceasefire, this proxy war idea, and how the US and Europe might be playing different roles. We even talked about how some people might actually benefit from this war, which is pretty messed up.
It's definitely been a serious conversation, but it's important to talk about these things. It makes us think critically and helps us understand how the world really works, even the parts that are hard to look at.
We talked about what each country wants, what could happen next, and how this could affect Europe, Ukraine, and everyone else.
Yeah, and maybe the biggest thing we talked about is this: how much power matters, how diplomacy can work, and what a huge cost conflict has.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's important to have these conversations, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into this whole situation. It's definitely complicated, but hopefully we help make things a little clearer.
It was great talking about this with you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.